Okay, so this panel has never been done in our opening. We really want to try something new this year. Our speakers wasn't given any questions from me, and I won't be asking a lot of questions to them today. So I want all these great minds to ask each other's questions instead of me asking questions. So maybe let's start with this special panel. Maybe Joe can first ask a question with your fellow speakers. I'm following up with what they just talk about.
Sure, sure. I actually would like to ask my neighbor, Kishore, a question. Unfortunately, they took me to the backstage to prepare when you were making your speech. I only heard about 2 certainties out of the 4 certainties. But my question is about your first certainty of CIA, right? China, India, ASEAN. How do we improve relations between China and India? Because these are 2 large countries with population almost 40% of the world. If China and India can get together, it's a very, very powerful economic force and geopolitical force. And I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I must say, I thought I was going to get easy questions. You asked me a very difficult question. I completely agree with your premise. I mean, if the 1.4 billion people of China can get along well with the 1.4 billion people in India, then I think we will have a wonderful Asian century. So if China and India focus on their own economic growth and focus on how they can actually work together, then it is possible for that to happen. And the good news is that China and India are also members of some organizations that bring them together, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which I'm sure Jin, LIQUN, and Andrew are familiar with, like BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa organization. So I think it's important for both countries, China and India, to use all these organizations that they are members of to try and develop closer ties. And I'm sure AIIB can also play a role down there. I know that you invest a lot in India, if I'm not mistaken, LIQUN.
Yeah, I think I can say a few words to respond to the question. Between 2 human beings, among the human beings, there are always differences, there are always troubles. But I think what is most important is we should agree to disagree. We first invited ASEAN countries, CIA, one of CIAs, right? And also, as India is the 2nd largest economy in Asia, we certainly engaged India. And we also tried to invite the United States, Japan to join, without success with this regards to these 2 countries. Now we have 106. How? Because we believe the humanity has a shared destiny. We have to work together in spite of the differences. India is the biggest shareholder, one of the biggest, 2nd largest shareholder. India is the biggest borrower of this bank. When some of the Western countries, ambassadors to China, look at our balance sheets, they could not possibly imagine that India would be the biggest borrowers of the AIIB. And secondly, if you look at Japan and United States, we have American nationals, Japanese nationals working in this institution, taking very important positions. And we also have very extensive cooperation with the American financial institutions, real sector businesses, and we also have very good cooperation with the US government. And that is why we can do a lot of things together. Are there differences? There will be differences, perhaps forever, but that's not mean we should not work together.
But the United States hasn't joined, right?
It's not. US is not. Yeah. But you see, we work with American governmental institutions. We had the share filing with the US SEC. And we have the global dollar bonds issuance with only about roughly 10 bips higher than that of the World Bank. If we can work together in AIIB, why not in other forum?
I agree, but I'm going to ask you now a difficult question, LIQUN. Will United States join in the next 10 years?
This is the sovereign decision of the US government. I cannot do it. Otherwise, I would be president of the United States, right? It's not possible. But let me comment on your points. You say the last 2 centuries are the centuries of the West European countries. But prior to that, it's the Asian nation. It's Asian centuries, millenniums. My question is, why the Western countries took over from the Asian countries, becoming advanced in virtually all respects? And why Asian countries could take over again? This tells us the humans are always learning from each other. The Western countries learn from the Asian civilization, and we learn from the Western civilization. The best students can always prevail. So this does not mean that Asian countries would be dominating the world forever for the next 1,000 years. Don't be so complacent. Thank you.
No, I agree. I completely agree. And in fact, one thing that we Asians should actually address very honestly is how is it that we in Asia fell so far behind the West in the 19th century and even in the first half of the 20th century? And so what we Asians need to go through now is a very strong process of what I call mental decolonization, where we acknowledge that we actually in some ways today can do as well as, if not better than in the West. And once we have mentally decolonized ourselves, then I think we can have a better, a more level playing field between Asia and the West. I know this is a subject that, Andrew, you actually hinted at in your opening remarks. Maybe you want to tell us a bit more about how Asia's space in the world can grow.
Well, let me. I thought you raised a big point: CIA, China, India, ASEAN. And people tend to forget that India and China, as civilizations, created, I won't say create, but actually was a huge influence on ASEAN. And people tend to forget, if you just go to Borobudur, you go to Bali, you would realize this is, there's a huge Indian, sort of influence, right? But at the same time, when you go there, you realize that there are native, indigenous culture of Majapahit, right? Then the influence from the Arabs, right? Influence of Islam, China. All these created a new kind of culture that arose from the old. So I think the point that I would really like to say is this. I've tried to ask a very fundamental question. Why is it that we're disagreeing? And the West thinks about me, and Asia thinks about we, right? It's that we are responsible for all of us. Each of us is not just an individual. We become we, right? Me becomes we, right? The individual. So that conversation has been asked for millennia in the Middle East, in India, in China, and in Indonesia, and the region, in fact, in South America. Now, the West grew because of science, and science was actually also an energy revolution. The Industrial Revolution was really an energy revolution. And thanks to the generosity of the West in sharing that technology, I think the East and the South has come back up again. So life is a cycle, right? So nothing is preordained. I do not believe that we are predestined for war. But if we are predestined for war, war is a path to peace, and peace is a path to war, right? We need to understand this cycle. And so the key question now for me, which Kishore, is that we really should not be talking about war. We should talk about how to get peace back. How do we cooperate together? How do we agree to disagree? And I think this conversation, having different platforms in which we exchange ideas on how we can find areas of commonality. And I think thinking systemically, I came to one conclusion which is very important for us in Asia, particularly in cities like like Macau, is think systemically, act locally. We can't, as small cities, influence the world. The world is just too large. But we can influence what we can around us. And if you're head of a firm, like Alibaba or AIB, that local is actually influencing your platform that will have influence globally, right? So once we begin to understand we are entangled with each other through networks, through very complex, relationships, how we manage that in a peaceful manner is critical for the world today.
Andrew, we've been friends for 30 years, right? And I'm very much impressed by your comment on we and me. Asians, we means we work as a community. And some people, I don't want to categorize the Western countries, to say Western ideas, individual rights is the utmost, I think, important thing. So they focus on individual rights. We put a premium on community rights, and that's the difference. And we should understand when the individual initiativeness is released, certainly that explains part of the Western civilization of the last 200 years. But excessively individualistic is really devastating, right? So you see the problems now. So my question is, how should the Asians work better as a community and also try to be more creative, innovative individually? That is very important because the community consists of individuals, and only when each and everyone works hard could the community be strong. So I think the challenge for the Asian countries to encourage individuals to be creative, to be innovative, and thinking about the community without taking advantage of the community, say, everybody else is working hard, I can simply relax. That is the problem.
No, I agree. I was going to say that question actually can be posed at two different levels. It can be posed within societies, how you balance the rights of the individual and the rights of society. And as you know, there is now in many ways effectively, I would say, a kind of a contest between what I call the Western model, which emphasizes more individual rights, and as Andrew said, in Asia, we endorse more the communal rights. And the remarkable thing about ASEAN is that even though it has 700 million people, and it will soon have a GNP bigger than Japan by the 2030. Despite all that, ASEAN, because it is a weak, in some ways ineffective, inefficient organization, because it is relatively weak, it is trusted by everybody. So the only organization that can invite all the countries of Asia to come together every year to meet and talk to each other, including, let's say, India and China, Japan and South Korea, Australia and New Zealand. Where is the one place they all come to? They come to ASEAN. And I think we in Asia don't appreciate the importance of ASEAN's convening power to put all the Asians in the same room and to have a civilized dialogue with one another. And then to talk about the community of shared future among Asians also. And that I think is something that we should pay more attention to. In fact, right now as we are speaking, there's an ASEAN summit going on in Bali, by the way. And that's important. And I think people in China certainly, and certainly people in the Greater Bay Area, should pay greater attention to ASEAN, because the synergies between the Greater Bay Area and ASEAN, especially on the economic front, are very significant.
So I want to interrupt a little bit. So we know that Asia or ASEAN, we have to work together, right? So I know Joe has been working so hard connecting both worlds, right? He owns a basketball team in NBA, being an Asian, right? And having foundation program in China, hoping to train teenagers to go to experience another culture. So I think what Beyond is we really want to be the melting pot or be the platform where both sides of the world can really work together. So we'd love to hear more about it.
So Jason, that's a very important point. I want to talk about the importance of people-to-people exchange. That's not at the official level or official summits and things like that, but people-to-people exchange in terms of sports, culture, academic cooperation, scientific cooperation. And the most famous people-to-people exchange example is the ping pong Chinese table tennis team and the Americans, which happened a long time ago.
1971, I think.
1971, yes. And now people lament the fact that, there's no more people-to-people exchange between the United States and China. Except that in sports, we have, I own a women's basketball team in New York. And one of our key players is Han Xu. She plays on the Chinese women's team. She's very tall, over 200 meters, 200 cm. And she is the most popular player when we play in New York. The Americans don't care what she looks like, as long as she plays good basketball. That's why it's so important. But here's the thing. We always worry more about people-to-people exchange between US and China. We forget about people-to-people exchange among China, ASEAN, India. Why shouldn't there be more people-to-people cooperation? For example, on the scientific front, between Chinese scientists and Indian scientists. We talk about quantum computing, right? We never hear about these things. There should be people-to-people exchange on the cultural front between China, India, and the rest of ASEAN. More entertainment-oriented stuff. All we hear about is just tourism, But I think we don't focus on those people-to-people exchange just among ourselves, Asians. We always worry about between East and West, but not among Asians. I think there should be more people-to-people exchange among Asians.
Joe, I think while you're right, I have another issue. While people-to-people exchange is important, do you think there's a huge challenge between robots and humans exchange? Because robots represent the ultimate wisdom of the humans. It's not an individual wisdom. It's the wisdom of the most intelligent people. And then if you find robots and humans exchange goes wrong, there could be huge disaster. And I'm very much worried about beyond what? Beyond our capacity to manage the robots. Do you think there's a serious challenge in this regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't worry about robots. Here's the thing. I have a philosophical question. People always say machine is going to become smarter than human beings. Well, here's the thing. We actually have not explored how smart the human brain can get. There's 80 billion neurons in the human brain and trillions of connections, synapses in the human brain. The potential of the human brain to get smarter and to operate at a higher capacity, I think we have not explored the possibilities. So you cannot conclude today that at some point machines will become smarter than human beings. And here's the other thing. I think it's very difficult to replicate some of the human aspects of emotional intelligence, touch and feel, hunger, desire, these are very, very fundamentally human that I don't think machines can replicate. So the good thing about people-to-people exchange is when computers talk to each other all the time and you're sitting behind a keyboard, your desire to meet that person behind the keyboard is even higher. That's why you want to, meet. Nobody ever got married just because they found someone online and never met the other person in real life, right? Maybe that's maybe 1% of the people do that, but that you always want to meet the person behind the computer. Who is that person? How do they look me in the eye? When they say something, I want it to be able to tell if he's telling the truth or not. And I think those are very important aspects I just do not believe robots can replace.
But at the same time, you see what worries me is that very, very intelligent, thoughtful people like Henry Kissinger, who's a good friend of China, Bill Gates, and the recent Google scientists, they've been warning that in the field of artificial intelligence, there is a danger of the human race being outpaced by AI. I mean, how do you worry about that?
In certain discrete fields, right, we're seeing more and more functions that humans can do are being replaced by AI. It used to be things that are very repetitive and machines can compute much faster. But now it seems like AI is overtaking human beings in the whole creative space.
And also lawyers.
Lawyers for sure. Yeah, I train as a lawyer, so I know how difficult it will get for lawyers. But I think that at the end of the day, machines don't eat. Machines don't have fathers and brothers and mothers and sisters, and it's the relationship among human beings. I think that's just very, very difficult to replace. Machines don't procreate, not in the human sense.
But this is actually one area where there should be a common interest between the United States and China. I think clearly, as I mentioned earlier, the contest between US and China will accelerate. But what will slow it down are common concerns like climate change. But another common concern that should develop between the United States and China is on developing a set of rules that humanity as a whole can accept and implement on how to manage AI, because this is the common challenge I think that both China and the US face. And here, this is where I hope that in future editions of Think Beyond, you get some American philosophers also in this room to balance the Chinese and other philosophers in this room to talk about how AI is a common challenge to humanity.
Andrew, what do you think about the global economic situation with the rising interest rates and the pressure on the highly indebted countries?
Well, I think, the conversation here is very fascinating because, the world is actually divided between the real world, the physical world, and the virtual world, right? The virtual world. Now, I'm a simple accountant. And when I started looking at quantum physics,
you're not simple. You're very complex.
No, I'm simple. It's all about debits and credits, right? And when I, looked at quantum, I suddenly realized that's exactly it. The physical world is the asset, and the virtual world is the liability. The liability is an imagination. You imagine that liability matches the asset. So, but the two of them are entangled. And so when you change the balance sheet of one entry, it would affect the other. 你中有我，我中有你. We are entangled, all right? What I find fascinating, when I was blown away by Joe's discussion, is that virtual entanglement on the economy is that the West has invented debt, which can be infinite, right? Physical is finite. We cannot, there's only just so much gold, oil, and iron or lithium. But imagination is infinite and costless once you actually think through it. So what has happened is that once you invented debt, you're basically consuming the world's resources on a credit card. And can this be forever? So to a large extent, we've gone into opium war 2.0 or 4.0, in which we create debt as the next opium. And that's really dangerous. Because if we overuse that imagination without understanding reality, why we got into trouble is that there's so many PhDs who only know one thing but cannot connect everything else. And learning is all about connecting the dots. Now, we are in this financial stage in which we had the 87 crisis, then the 97 crisis, and the 07 crisis. 2017 should have been a crisis, but they invented QE. They just printed more money. And so the crisis morphed from a financial crisis to a political crisis and a social crisis that was turbocharged through social media, right? That began to split the world because everybody was in their little cocoons and say, I am the good guy, is the others are the bad guy, forgetting that we really physically need to talk to each other. So essentially, what we're seeing today is a divorce in which you send each other emails, and maybe you use a metaverse way of explaining why we disagree, but the physical implications are huge. We can solve a lot of things through imagination, but if we are not careful, that distorted imagination can really cause the real world to be in serious imbalance. And I think the reason why Asia is less affected by the finance and the economics is because we're more practical. We don't completely believe the theory. We don't believe that the assumptions under that theory are forever true. We do not believe there is an absolute truth. Truth is actually relative. And it's that relativity that's causing us huge divide at this point of moment. You know,
Andrew, just a quick practical question. How much more debt can the US government accumulate before actually the world says, maybe you'll never be able to pay off this debt? At what point, what is that? Is there a theoretical point? Right now, US is about 70 to 80% of GDP, am I correct?
well, the US debt is now the same as the end of World War II.
So 70 to 80% or
No, 100% of GDP.
100% GDP. So what's the maximum limit? 150, 200, 250%? At what point do you say, okay, this is a problem?
The real issue is, can this continue at the present rate? And, you know, something goes, you know, can be extended in the short term, but it cannot be there forever. Sooner or later, that music has to stop. And so why has, you know, this become much more complex? Because the dollar, which from 1945 onwards was a global public good, everybody wanted the dollar, has become weaponized. And once it becomes weaponized, it's no longer a public good, it becomes a taxation. And when you get back down to no taxation without representation, that's when we need everybody's voice in this. So essentially, the Fed is running global monetary policy, but the Fed has no global mandate. It's actually only for the United States. And that's where it gets extremely complicated.
I have a question for President Jing. How soon will the dollar be replaced by other currencies as a means of trade and commerce?
I don't think it's an issue of replacement. It's an issue of the relative importance of dollar vis-a-vis RMB. Dollar would still be the international reserve currency, while China's RMB would be increasingly important. So replacement means dollar is completely off the screen. That's not possible. Now, when? I don't want to predict, particularly I don't want to predict the future, okay? But there's one point. The snapping point of the dollar depends on a couple of factors. certainly the rising of the RMB and maybe other currencies in Asia, or more important role to be played by euro, would be certainly reducing the dollar's importance in international settlement. But have you noticed that the interview Fareed Zakaria had with Yellen not long ago? And for the first time, the senior US official acknowledged that weaponization of the dollar is increasingly eroding the hegemon of the US dollar. Because just
She admitted it.
uh-huh.
Janet
That's
admitted
right. That's
it.
right. In the CNN interview,
Wow.
because it's eroding.
That's unusual.
I think almost verbatim. She said, excessive use of the dollar to sanction countries is increasingly eroding the hegemony of the dollar.
Wow.
Because people are staying away from the dollar. Now, the question is when. Nobody can say that because it depends on other factors. Just like the Asian financial crisis, right? The loss of balance, a trade balance, was obvious, but it didn't happen until all of these countries had a problem, right?
I just want to supplement this. If you believe in a rule-based order, how is it that the sanction can be unilateral for which there is no appeal? Right? I don't mind being sanctioned if I can appeal to a court and say, look, you have to justify this. But there's no appeal in the sanction. And now the sanction is not just against a state, but against a firm and an individual. And that is at the heart of the world's rule-based order.
I think they're treading into territory that nobody knows will happen because it was easy to sanction Russia. Russia is a relatively smaller economy, so dollar sanctions on Russian central bank and oligarchs could be contained. Russia, it's a smaller economy. In the case of China, it's a massive economy with trade all over the world. If Chinese trading partners and Chinese start avoiding dollars because of sanctions, that actually will lead to the self-destruction of the dollar.
Jason, we are running out of time, but one important message I must give the audience. You see, this is very much important, and Andrew is an expert. The dollar's role in international settlement depends on the US economy and its trade with the rest of the world. That's very important. Now, with the US GDP in relative terms is going down, continuing going down, to keep the dollar to take 70 or 75% of international settlements is not possible. So please do not think when RMB is taking more important role, RMB is destroying the dollar. That's wrong, please, that is wrong. RMB is taking off the huge pressure on the dollar because the Truman dilemma would eventually set in. Dollar would be completely destroyed if US went bankruptcy. So when RMB is playing a more important role, taking off the pressure, the Truman dilemma could be handled. So RMB is not to drive away dollar. RMB would be working better with dollar and some other currencies to maintain the international order of trade, investment, and finance. That is very much important. I hope people will not misunderstand this.
I really hope this panel can go way longer than it is. But then, as President Jin said, that we are running out of time. So let's give our speakers a round of applause. Thank you so much for being on stage.